Gibson. I'm the Associate Chair of the Department of Communication at George Mason University. And today's panel, I'm very pleased to bring to you our panel of top papers in media criticism. I'll just introduce the papers, and then my colleague David Miller will introduce the panelists. First, we have Transgender Identity Through the Media, From Bruce to Caitlyn, by Grace Novak from George Mason University. Second, we have Symbolic Tears for Crybaby, delivered today by Mercy Wheeler from George Mason University. And then finally, Steven Universe, A Feminist and Queer Theory Analysis by Michelle Yabes, also from George Mason University. So I'd like to thank all our panelists for being here today.
Just one housekeeping note for those students who are here from this current semester's COM 380. May I see your hands? Are you here? Cool. All right. I'm going to pass around this really improvised sheet if you could sign in, because I know you're here not only because you want to hear these wonderful presentations, but you're also here for some credit. So, yes, if you could pass this down, that would be great. And I'll make an announcement at the end as well for anyone who comes in. Okay, just a brief bio. Today we have, on the program you'll see 4 people listed. Unfortunately, Hazel Saunders could not be here. She had a family emergency, so that's why she will not be presenting today. In no particular order, Michelle Yabes is a recent cum laude graduate of George Mason University. She majored in international affairs, taking on a double concentration in global governance and media communication and culture, and minored in German. Michelle was on the dean's list for 5 semesters, and she was awarded twice as well for excellence in German in 2013 and 15. She was also a member of GMU's Filipino Cultural Association and the Catholic Campus Ministries. And she's from Philippines and moved to Arlington, Virginia in the fall of 1997. Michelle is currently a communication and development intern at the Louis Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law here in Washington, D.C. Next, we have Mercy Wheeler, professional. Mercy Wheeler has a scholarship chair of the Gender Inclusive Honors Fraternity, Phi Sigma Pi, elected historian of Phi Sigma Pi in 2016 and 2017. She has been a consistent Dean's List member since her freshman year onwards. She is a communication major with a minor in film, with a concentration in media production and criticism. And she's right from our neighborhood here in Burke, Virginia. And Grace Novak is here with her last semester as undergraduate student at George Mason University, who is also majoring in communication with a concentration in media production and criticism and a minor in computer science. She's been on the Dean's List at Mason from 2012 to 2015, and she's also from Burke, Virginia. Burke, Virginia. So why don't we just give them a hand before we begin? Grace Novak will move on first.
Hello, good morning everybody. I'm Grace, as has been said. This is my paper that I wrote for my media criticism class. So what I did was I wrote a paper on the interview between Caitlyn Jenner and Diane Sawyer, which premiered on April 24th. I believe it was ABC. It premiered to like 17.1 million viewers. It was very much reported on widely throughout the media, and it caused a really big spark. So just to introduce why I started talking about this topic, coming to Mason and coming to college is a big time in most young people's lives. If you're coming straight out of high school, it's a time for you discovering your identity and discovering who you are and who you want to be. And that journey is a lot harder for a lot of different people depending on the kind of person you are, especially when the media that you're exposed to is primarily white, primarily heterosexual, and primarily male. So if you're a white straight male, it's pretty easy. You turn on the TV and you're pretty much represented immediately. But transgender youths, minority youths, LGBT youths are people who aren't as represented in the media. And so their journey into coming to understand their identity and be accepted by their peers is a lot harder one. So as someone who wants to be a media producer myself, I want to be a professional videographer, I want to edit, I think it's important to know what exactly the media is missing and what needs to be changed so that it's more representative of everybody and it's easier for you to accept your peers who you haven't been exposed to before. All right. So, as I said, I wrote my paper on the interview. I'm just going to show a quick clip of the promo. There we go. You're going to have to watch this short ad.
You check your oil and battery life with an app. How sci-fi is that? Dad's wheelbarrow? That was his dad. Hello, arrow card. Dad's tools weren't this tough or this cordless. Imagine what Dad could have done with the tools you have. Then imagine all you can do this weekend. Get this lightweight design Ryobi 18-volt trimmer now at just $69.97. The Home Depot. More safe, more doing. Breaking his silence with dialogue. America watched him with awe in the Olympics and images of him as a young father. And in recent years, the life we saw as all of those reality cameras rolled. But tonight, what we didn't see is a real one.
This is the man America rooted for, a family man. There were early photos of fatherhood, an Olympic champion, winning the 76th Olympic gold medal in the decathlon, setting a world record. Afterwards, the Weavon, and a lifetime of fame. Then came the role outside the sports arena. There was a starring role in Hollywood, and in recent years, the reality show with his wife Chris and their giant blended family. After all those feats, that gifted athlete now facing a new chapter in life. A chapter he said he's finally ready for.
I've got my house. I've got my children. I've got family. I've got 7 grandkids now. I'm actually really excited about the future, about what I could do to be able to do some real good in the world.
Telling Diane exclusively about a part of his life far from the cameras.
What's the question you would ask me? What's the question? If I were you, what question would you ask me? Are you going to be okay? You know? Are you going to be okay? Yeah. I hope I'm going to be okay. I feel like I'm going to be okay. 2015 is going to be quite a ride. Quite a ride.
The man we once rooted for at the Olympics now looks to the future, worried most about his children.
Those are the only ones I'm concerned with. I can't let myself hurt them. And Diane is here now. He says his concern is for his children.
Okay. So that was the promo. They didn't really mention her transition in the promo, I'm pretty sure, because at that point she hadn't really decided to go by the name Caitlyn or to go by female pronouns. So actually the original title of my paper was From Bruce to Belinda because her name hadn't been revealed yet. And I think she was reporting to some news outlets that it might be Belinda. But anyway, so as the promo mentioned, Caitlyn Jenner was formerly Bruce Jenner, who was a former Olympic athlete, primarily known in my generation for his role on Keeping Up with the Kardashians. As you can see, they're pretty much a household name. As it goes with celebrities, they are famous for being famous. So basically, most people aren't really sure why everybody knows who these people are. But I've never seen the show. I hear it's kind of interesting, but these are, as I said, household names. So the interview was facilitated with Diane Sawyer, and basically it was 2 hours long. It spanned her discussion of coming out as a transgender woman, and at that point she wasn't going by female pronouns, but I think it was a couple weeks later when they came out with her Vanity Fair cover where it was I Am Caitlyn. So that was the first time she came out officially as a woman. So my paper basically goes into the way the media covered this, the way people reacted to this. There were some headlines where, as I wrote here from internet publication The Blaze, Bruce Jenner is not a woman, he is a sick and delusional man. This is just one example of what a lot of transgender people go through especially on the internet, which is not a nice place. And the problem with Caitlyn Jenner's, the way that she came out through the media is that it's heavily focused on her appearance. So there is a kind of misunderstanding with how most transgender, the majority of transgender youths and their experiences coming out. It's not exactly like this. I think that this is a good start because they're so invisible in the media, and I go into this in my paper about studies that have been done of transgender characters in narrative fiction or nonfiction, and they're usually being portrayed as villains, as sexual workers, as victims. And that's a problem because it doesn't really represent the truth about transgender people. And so I think this interview is important because it starts a conversation that a lot of people haven't had before. I didn't really realize a lot of truths about transgender people until I came into college and was studying feminist theory, gender theory, and understanding what exactly it means to be that kind of person in our society today. And I think it's important as a creator myself to want to represent this kind of group in a more, in a reality that is actually true to reality. So this is another picture of Caitlyn. Then I have a chart here of some of the research that I was reporting on. I didn't do this research. This is from GLAAD, which is an organization that does research on LGBTQ representation in the media. And so this is just an example of how few transgender characters are being portrayed on TV today. There are some you might know, like Orange is the New Black. There's a transgender female character who's a good representation in some ways on that TV show. But there's really not a lot. It definitely hasn't even really increased at all. So I think that this is something that could be fixed in the future. Here's another example of characters that you might know who are transgender and fictional transgender characters. Another problem with transgender representation, especially on narrative, film, and TV, is a lot of times they're not actually played by real transgender people. They're played by cis hetero people who aren't transgender at all, and that's obviously an issue. So in my paper, I go into basically how heteronormative representation affects our perceptions of the world, and as Ott and Mack wrote in their book on media criticism, people often turn to the media, consciously or unconsciously, in order to form values about the world we live in today, and those values influence the impressions we have of ourselves and of society. So basically, in conclusion, it's important that we change the way we represent transgender people, and not only that, but minority groups, on TV because it reflects how we see the world. So you couldn't go into the world and think that there are no transgender people just because they're not on TV, and I think that's a big problem because it's harder to accept and understand them in this way. That's my presentation. Thank you. Who's next?
Is it on here?
Yeah.
Or, okay. There you go. Okay. Okay, so just a very quick disclaimer. This presentation does include language and potentially disturbing imagery. It's all illustrated, but I don't know if it would make anyone in this room a little queasy or not. So my presentation is on Crybaby by Melanie Martinez. This was the debut album that was released in August 15th, 2015. It's a concept album that follows the narrative of the titular protagonist, Crybaby. Martinez reported in an interview that Crybaby was meant to be a fairy tale version of herself, not a full representation of Martinez's life, but rather a character in a story. Like most stories, symbolism plays a key role in both driving the narrative and adding depth to any derived meaning of the story. By studying the symbolism in Crybaby with semiotic theory, a deeper analysis of both the story and potential social commentary embedded into the story can be achieved. Semiotic theory allows the study of meaning and communicated symbols and the potential decoded meaning based on the receiver's interpretation of the information. Essentially, this album is music as storytelling. It is actively telling a story of Crybaby, and while Martinez did not intend to write a social commentary on any particular one thing, she did derive a lot of the concepts and ideas for her album from her own experiences, from her own childhood experiences especially, and her own experiences as a young woman. She was 20 years old at the time of the release, and all of the lyrics were written by herself with some help with producers. There's depth and multiple meanings in every line, and it assists in the narrative of the story and the resulting analysis, particularly of childhood and femininity. In addition to lyrical and instrumental symbolism, there's a visual component to the album. In the physical copy, there's a baby board book, essentially, and each track has its own illustration. The first group of songs, Crybaby, Dollhouse, and Sippy Cup, introduce Crybaby and her home life. Crybaby is introduced as an emotional, tearful, friendless girl who knows far too much about all the issues that are found in her family. They're determined to hide their personal problems behind a fake plastic sheen to protect any outsiders from knowing what's going on. In Dollhouse and Sippy Cup, it's revealed that Crybaby's mother is an alcoholic due to her husband's infidelity. This, among other dysfunctions in her family, leads to her mother, in the story, murdering the father and hiding the deed from her children. And this is a clip from, we're going to watch an ad first.
Anyone can get out right now.
All right. So this is the music video for Sippy Cup. We're just going to listen and watch to a couple of seconds, so I won't expand it too much.
He's still dead when you don't make the bottle. Of course it's a corpse that you keep in the cradle. Kids are still the price when you dress them up. Syrup is the syrup in the sippy cup.
If taken less literally and more interpretively, symbolically dead and corpse could mean emotionally disappeared or unwilling to participate in the facade of a perfect family life. The father is still having an affair even though his wife is drinking to forget it, and perhaps there was an attempt to save the crumbling relationship with the child. The corpse in the cradle that failed to save it, probably Crybaby herself. Even if the pretty facade is added, conflict and trauma exist behind the surface. The themes of facades and denial in the face of trauma is reoccurring. Crybaby's life is at some level determined by her home life and personal trauma. Dollhouse and Sippy Cup also introduce the relatively unique instrumental factor of Crybaby, at least in comparison to other mainstream music releases. Martinez uses vintage toy sound effects throughout the album, intentionally juxtaposing cheerful and familiar sounds of childhood against lyrics describing ugly, uncomfortable adult situations and feelings. Toy pianos especially are a common sound throughout the album. Carousel, Alphabet Boy, Soap, and Training Wheels are about romantic relationships, all with underlying problems. Carousel with low horns and accordions to create a carnival atmosphere, which was also featured in the trailer for American Horror Story. It describes a relationship that feels like a carousel. He keeps her at a distance, but strings her along in circles to make her believe it'll come closer. Alphabet Boy is about a boy that does not take Crybaby seriously because she's older and more educated. This particular song uses alliteration in order to show her own unique take on lyrics using alliteration and alphabet.
Always aiming paper at things at me when you're around. You build me up like building blocks just so you can bring me down. You can crush my candy cane, but you'll never catch me cry. If you dangle
The alliteration is clever and brings attention to the prove-you-wrong mentality that Crybaby has in response to the situation. An immature response, but probably accurate for the age range that she's supposed to be representing. But it does also show that metaphorically she knows her ABCs, even when she's writing her lyrics. In Soap, Crybaby tries to hide her feelings towards another boy that she likes, comparing her sudden confession to a faucet running. She wants to retract her confession and erase it entirely with soap, as if she had spoken a profanity. Training Wheels is the only true love song of the album, and even so, it's not necessarily about a healthy relationship. Crybaby mentions that she loves it when the boy calls her dumb for the stupid things that she does. When put in the context of Crybaby and the rest of the lyrics, however, it sounds like she's willing to ignore potentially abusive and unloving words as long as she's allowed into an intimate relationship. Training Wheels also has music box sounds throughout the song, reinforcing the idea of childhood and sounds indicating childlike behavior. The centerpiece and single of the album, the original single of the album, is Pity Party. This was fitted together with the sample of the 1965 song by Leslie Gore, It's My Party. In the original song, the singer describes her distress and sadness that her boyfriend has arrived to a party in the company of another girl. In Pity Party, not only has Crybaby's boyfriend not shown up, but nobody else came either. This is the turning point of the album. In Martinez's own words, this is the part where Crybaby goes crazy. Tag Your It utilizes metaphors like cut you up and make you dinner and took the words right out my mouth for a sexual assault. Martinez sings for Crybaby in her attacker with the assailant's voice pitched down and added noise, creating a distorted and frightening effect. Milk and Cookies describes Crybaby's murderous revenge on her attacker by feeding him spoiled milk and drug-laced cookies. Pacify Her shows how Crybaby... Oh, I'm missing a slide. Pacify Her, it shows how Crybaby no longer feels empathy for others and only wants to hurt them by ruining their relationships. The illustration for this one is essentially she's pushing a pacify her into another girl's mouth. Mrs. Potato Head is one of the most lyrically complex tracks on the album and discusses the futility of cosmetic plastic surgery. This particular track illustrates the naturally unattainable norms for female beauty and youth. And we're going to listen to just a few.
Kids forever, baby soft skin turns into lather. Don't be dramatic, it's all like some plastic. No one will love you if you're unattractive. Oh, Mrs. Potato Head, tell me, is it true that pain is beauty? Does a good face come with a warranty? Will a pretty face make it better? Oh, Mrs. Potato Head, tell me, how did you afford it surgery? Do you swear you'll stay forever, even if our face don't stay together?
My apologies for the loud volume, by the way. Martinez doesn't appear to pass a negative or positive judgment on the act, however, simply acknowledging that it exists and why it exists. Cosmetic changes only for the reason that there is high value placed on beauty in women. Mad Hatter is the final track of the album and uses references from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, including the title, which is a common text to reference to when talking about perceived madness or strangeness. She mentions skinny dipping rabbit holes for fun and getting drunk with a blue caterpillar to illustrate deviant ideas in the terms of a regular social society. Similar to Alice, Crybaby begins the album crying, flooding in the tears flooding around her in the illustration, and ends with the acceptance of her surroundings in an attempt to make some twisted sense of them. She makes a decision a little bit different from Alice in the book. In conclusion, when listening to concept albums like Crybaby, to have a full and analytical experience, one must consider the symbolism and multiple meanings that can be found in the lyrics, instrumentation, and video components. The reason that I really wanted to analyze this album in particular was because there is a significant lack in mainstream music for concept albums that tell a narrative story. And music is not necessarily seen as a format that can tell a narrative story anymore. Singles are more common. Very, very commonly, artists are discouraged from creating concept albums that have narratives because they do not sell as well as albums with singles. However, I wanted to show that it is still possible to have a narrative concept album. And Martinez, her whole idea of what makes music so great is the storytelling aspect. In a 2015 interview, she said the following about the album and the rest of basically the concept of the album. In the music business, you can't be soft about things. I've gotten better about that, but it's been very hard for me because I'm very emotional. And then in a later interview, she stated that all of her music, the goal is to tell a story. The goal is to tell a story, and all the rest of her albums, she hopes, will be connected to Cry Baby, as in it will tell a narrative story. It's this individual and personal understanding of both storytelling and taking concepts like childhood and insecurity that makes Cry Baby such a wonderful album. Thank you.
Our final presentation of the session is Michelle Yabes from Gibson University. And then again, we'll have time for questions.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Hi, I'm Michelle Yabes. Today I'll be talking about the paper I did last spring on Steven Universe through a feminist and queer analysis. Here's a basic outline of my presentation. Today I'll be talking briefly about the show premise and its themes. Then we'll move on to the feminist analysis and talking about a couple episodes. And then I'll move on to queer analysis, and we'll be using 3 episodes of it as examples, and the implications that representation in the show has, and the conclusion. In my paper, I argued that, or I attempted to analyze elements of Steven Universe through feminist and queer analysis, or theory. And I argued how the subversion of hegemonic ideas and themes in the show and its diverse representation can positively impact its young audience. So the show premise and its themes, it centers around a young boy, Steven. He is not quite like other young boys, as he is half human and half gem. Gems in the show's canons are a race of extraterrestrial magical beings that are named after their gems that are inlaid on their bodies. They can project their forms and change them at their own will. And they possess multiple abilities, such as summoning weapons from their gems, super strength, super speed, and they can fuse with each other, just to name a few. While they can project any form they wish onto themselves, they use feminine pronouns and mostly take on feminine forms or appear to be female. And even though they do this, they are inherently sexless, and they do not have a concept of gender. With the exception being Steven. The one important element of the show is that Steven's mother gave up her physical form to give birth to him, and the show is pretty much his coming of age story. It follows him as he tries to find his own way to harness his power as a gem, his identity between seeing himself as a human and a gem, the relationships he has with his gem, or the gems he lives with that primarily raise him, garnet, amethyst, and pearl, as well as the other residents of Beach City, and the intersection of his own world as he sees it and reality. So some interesting things to note about the show was that when it first came out in 2013, the creator, Rebecca Sugar, became the first sole woman creator on Cartoon Network, and Cartoon Network was about 21 or 22 years old at the time. So it was a long time coming. Steven is a non-traditional male lead. He does not adhere to hegemonic ideas of masculinity, and I'll talk more about this as I go on in the presentation. Another interesting thing to note is that the cast has a wide, diverse range of body types in their characters on screen, and with the actors behind the mic, there's also a wide range of diversity. So the reason I decided to do this paper was I was drawn to the show as it was really positive, and I found it really unique, and I thought it would be really interesting to analyze it through some of the concepts we learned in class. So with the feminist analysis of media, I'll be discussing some of the terms that Rosalind Jill talks about in her article, Post-Feminist Media Culture. So first off, I note that this show does not adhere to the typical separation of the sexes or notion that there's a natural difference between the sexes. And Jill states in her article that this is very uncommon, as a separation of the sexes, or the notion of the difference between them is common in most media. And she notes that this is a key feature of what she calls post-feminist sensibility. And this assumption that there is a separation of the sexes is that there's a natural discourse between the sexes, and that men and women are fundamentally different. And it's also the idea that men and women do not do not understand each other. As Jill describes, this idea is present and perpetuated throughout various forms of media, and constructs a deeper divide between masculinity and femininity, as well as re-eroticizes the power relations between men and women. She goes on to say on page 159 that that a notion of a natural difference between genders can freeze existing inequalities by representing them as inevitable. However, this is not the case in the show. One example I use is the episode Giant Woman. At the onset of the episode, Steven finds out that gems have the ability to fuse and turn into a bigger gem, and he thinks he's never seen this before, so he's really excited, and he wants Pearl and Amethyst to fuse because he wants to see their fusion opal. And throughout the episode, he's singing about how he would really want to see them, and saying this one line, "If it were me, I would really want to be a giant woman," trying to convince them that they should fuse. And as you can see, when he finally does see the fusion, he's in awe, he's really happy, showing that he has this great admiration for them. And by saying that, oh, I would want to be a giant woman if I were you, he's pretty much showing that he doesn't see this difference of the sexes, or he doesn't think that there's a shameful divide between them. So this is the way that Rebecca Sugar plays with gender in the show is intentional. In an interview that came out after I finished my paper, when she was asked about this, she confirmed it, saying, yes, it's completely intentional. One of her goals for the show was to tear down and play with the semiotics of genders in children's cartoons, because she pretty much says that when she was younger, she didn't really understand how, that she wasn't allowed to enjoy boy shows, but she did as a girl. And so she wanted to use the show as a vehicle to play with that, and to show that everyone can enjoy a form of media no matter what their gender is. And that idea that there's a separation of the genders is absurd. Another thing Jill talks about in her article is the idea of femininity as bodily property. And she defines this bodily property as the idea that a woman's value is put into pretty much what her body. It's seen as the sole source of her identity, and perhaps the sole key to her identity. she notes how post-feminist media culture is obsessive in its preoccupation with the body. And as a result, women's bodies are constantly monitored, they're constantly under surveillance, disciplined, and remodeled in order to conform to ever narrower judgments of female attractiveness. So in the show Steven Universe, it includes a wide range of different body types for each of its female characters and its entire cast in general. The body image of each female character is not discussed as a point of their, or made a central point of their identity, nor is it shown to be in the factor that is how they identify themselves with. The one occurrence that there was an objective statement made about a female body was committed by a minor character, and he was immediately berated for this comment. In the episode Story for Steven, Steven's father retells how he met his mother, and at one point in the episode when he's talking to his former friend and manager about how he's so in love with Steven's mother Rose, his friend responds with a comment like he didn't understand and says, "See, Greg, this is your problem. You want one huge woman when you could have multiple smaller ones." To which he responds in disgust, "Ugh, Marty, women are people." And shortly afterwards, the friend Marty is kicked out of his van and Greg drives home to Beach City. Let's see. Oops, sorry. And the next thing I discussed in my paper is the idea of the ritual of rebellion that Westerfelhaus and LaCroix talk about in their article, Seeing Straight Through Queer Eye, exposing the strategic rhetoric of heteronormativity in a mediated ritual of gay rebellion. So pretty much a ritual of rebellion grants their participants temporary license to violate selected social cultural rules, and in doing so they provide a much needed outlet for expressing and relieving social tensions. However, rather than threatening the dominant order, such rituals actually promote the social stability even though they seem to challenge it. So he goes on to say that the hegemonic values end up being reaffirmed and reasserted, and as well as the social structure of the dominant order. He also goes on to say that queer shows are often formulated through a ritual of rebellion that are filled with tactile and verbal transgressions that stop short of overt homosexuality. So they discuss how this formula imposes constraints and restraints that prohibit any critiques or complaints from being made. And in the show they use the example in the article they use the example of in the show that the Fab Five, they could like high five or like pet the straight men they were helping, but they could never do anything like overtly sexual, like kiss them or anything like that. So earlier episodes of Steven Universe do fall into these ritual of rebellion where they just stop short of making any explicit queer, of showing any explicitly queer aspects. However, later episodes further develop them. So in the first episode that I talked about as an example is Alone Together. In this episode, Steven accidentally fuses with his best friend and crush Connie, and they form Stevani, who is this tall, slender person, and when they are walking around Beach City together, they, pretty much all of the adolescents in the town find them very attractive. Stevani's gender is not explicitly stated throughout the episode, but later on, one of the writers for the show confirmed on Twitter that Stevani uses they and them pronouns. In the next episode, Rose's Scabbard, Pearl is implied to have had very strong romantic feelings for Rose. Speaking about her with the highest respect, when asked about what she was like by Steven, she goes on to say that she was intelligent and she was beautiful, and she blushes when she's talking about her. She also becomes visibly upset and insulted when the closeness of their relationship, when she feels the closeness of their relationship comes into question. And she later states in the episode, "Everything I did for her." The most explicit relationship described in the show at the time this paper was written was that of Garnet. We find out in the season 1 finale that she's actually a fusion herself between the gems Ruby and Sapphire. In this episode, the crystal gems in Steven are captured by homeworld gems that are hostile towards the planet, and Garnet ends up being split up by Jasper, and we don't know how long Ruby and Sapphire were together before this, but Ruby is obviously upset when they are separated and when they're trying to find each other. With Steven's help, they find each other. And in this clip, I'll show you. We can see how much they care for each other, and we're happy to be reunited. Oh. That is not the right one. Oh, okay. Oops. Sorry, I haven't used anything that's not a Mac in a long time. Oops. Oh, here we go. Oops. I'm sorry about this.
Whoa, now it's going to be really loud.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we're
So yeah, so they see each other after being separated and run into each other's arms and, oh.
I'm okay. Did they hurt you? Who cares? I do. Steven! Thank you.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So as you can see that they were very happy to see each other, and you could see just how much they cared for each other and how happy they were to be reunited again. So the implications of representation. So Gray talks about how television can provide a visual representation for the unknown and is often the only means for how one group is informed about one another. Representation in the media can have a profound impact on how we view ourselves and how we view others by constructing images that can either perpetuate or dismantle stereotypes and ideologies. So in a article by Brian Shelter for the NY Times, he quotes a professor of communications at the University of Minnesota who simply says that TV and movie representation matters. He found in 5 separate studies that the presence of gay characters on television programs decreases prejudices among viewers of the program. And a blogger, May, discusses this as well in a post she made. She said that kids see people like them positively portrayed in the media they consume. They are positively impacted, and when they don't see the same representation, it negatively affects not only them but how others view and treat people like them. In the same in the article by Brian Shelter, he takes a quote from Chaz Bono, the first transgender man to compete on Dancing with the Stars, who says, if someone like me was on TV when I was growing up, my whole life would have been different. So in conclusion, as I described in this presentation, Steven Universe is one of the unique cartoon shows of today that attempts to subvert hegemonic ideas and themes. The way the show's creators attempts this is through the positive depiction of the relationship between sexes and not reinforcing the idea of inherent sexual discourse, as well as criticizing those ideas. It also showcases overt, non-heteronormative themes and queer characters. Thus, the representation and the normalization of these aspects, as they're never questioned within the show, can positively impact how the audience views themselves and other groups. And that's all I have. And Steven is rerunning on Sundays if anyone wants to watch.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions. About 12 minutes for questions. So, any questions for any of our panelists?
Yeah.
If our panelists would come up to the front. Yeah, go ahead and sit down.
Do you want to sit down? Oh, sorry. I should have taken this. No, you're totally fine.
There we go.
For your presentation on Crybaby, did you say that the narrative story related to her life, or was it just like a story she was trying to convey, or was it like her own personal story?
So, Martinez described Crybaby as a fairy tale version of herself. So she utilized a lot of her own experiences. She identified as a very emotional child when she was growing up. She was relatively friendless. She was bullied very often. So she drew in a lot of her own experiences, but some of the songs like Tag Your It and Milk and Cookies never happened. They were basically responses to what kind of narrative she wanted to tell, kind of juxtaposing childhood themes with dark and ugly themes like murder or sexual assault.
Back there.
Again, for do you think, because you talked a lot about how narrative concept albums are really great things, do you think that it would have been as good if it didn't have the underlying issues and social commentary kind of, if it was just like some fantasy that had no real stake, or do you think that either way it helped?
Personally, I think because she drew in her own personal experiences, there has to be some sort of meaning, there has to be some sort of commentary on it just because she is drawing from her own experiences and from what she has seen as she's grown up. I think that if she had, there was lots of good reviews for the album itself. One of the reviews that wasn't so good did mention that because it was a concept album, it might not sell as well, it might not be as popular. But I think that there's really a desire for narrative storytelling in music because we are so used to hearing the same sort of love songs over and over again, like very same old. So I think that it might have sold better, but it may not have done as well as an analytical or intellectual property.
Yeah.
So this is something I thought of during the Steven Universe presentation, but it can be geared towards all of you. I realized that you sort of pick something that's sort of popular in the media, and it's something that takes a tough topic, which is like queer identity and stuff, and it's something that is very present in mainstream media. And I think all of you picked something that was relatively mainstream. You took Caitlyn Jenner, you took
Melanie Martinez.
Yeah, and they're all relatively popular, but but I find that when I'm trying to find a topic that is tough, I tend to go into something that's not mainstream. I find something that isn't. So is there a reason you chose these things? Like, do you think they are all things that do take a good position on these ideas, or did you specifically pick them because they are like mainstream?
Well, for me, I think I picked mine because it was mainstream, because I wanted to find something that represented transgender identity in the media that reached out to as many people as possible. Like I said, it reached 17 million viewers. So because of that, I think it shows not only the good of showing transgender identity on TV, but the bad of it, and how, like I said, Caitlyn Jenner is definitely not the best transgender role model, not at all. But it shows that we're starting to talk about it, and that's why it was important for me.
For me, I picked Steven at first because I really liked the show and I saw how it intersected with a lot of things we were talking about in class. And at the time, Steven wasn't as popular as it is this year, and the show didn't develop a lot of its themes until now. Like now, they have more episodes that are more overt, and I would have loved to have used as examples. But I guess the reason I picked it was because it was so positive, and as a child, I didn't see that many shows that were positively depicting anything that wasn't like heteronormative or like hegemonic, so I thought that was really interesting.
And I picked Crybaby because I think it's really important for albums and media in general that uses non-mainstream ideas to break into the mainstream, because if the concepts are not brought up in a way that is digestible by the general public, at least at some level, then those ideas probably won't be able to be broken through just in general.
I know that there's, with Caitlyn Jenner, there's been a lot of positivity that's come out of it, I guess, with people feeling more comfortable coming out, or like transgender or anything. I was wondering if there been any studies about the universe, about how if children are more accepting, or if they feel more compelled to be themselves from the storylines, or anything of the sort.
So at the time that I wrote the paper, there wasn't anything about it because the show was still relatively new. But right now, I'm not sure if they're trying to develop a study to look at this. But I've read just like unofficial like blog posts and things, and like articles from people on the internet, and they comment on how this could be like great for kids and like young people. I've seen like writings from young people who are like, I'm seeing myself in this show and I've never seen myself before, and I find this is great. But as far as an official study, I don't know yet. I'd like to see one if it does come out. But
Any other questions? I have a number of students here who are writing on media, and they have papers due coming up really shortly. And this is more of a process question, not specific to the paper that you've written, but what advice would you give to students taking media criticism now in terms of, finding a topic and doing the research? All of your papers seem to be very well researched. Do you have any suggestions, tips for the rest of us?
I think it's important to pick a topic that you like and that you're interested in. Don't pick something because you think it's going to be easy or maybe it's popular right now, but I think it's important that this is a topic that's interesting to you and that's important to you, because it gives you more of a motivation to like actually seek out and do the research. It's more of a fun experience.
Yeah, definitely do something that you actually care about. My personal suggestion would be, don't be afraid to use sources that you don't necessarily would think would be relevant to what you're talking about. Synthesize what you know and synthesize what knowledge you may be able to bring to the table, even if it's not necessarily directly involved with the subject at hand. So I actually went out and I did some research on like childhood development theories and what might have caused this. Like, even if it's a fictional narrative, there are still underlying themes and consequences that we see in the real world that end up being translated into narrative fiction.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo what they said. Definitely pick something that you're interested or passionate about, because half of the paper is, the motivation for the paper is just because you're interested in learning more and putting what you want together. And yeah, for me, it was like I had to synthesize a lot of information that wasn't directly related to Stephen. There was no like specific academia on it at the time. So I definitely had to pull from different resources, and you'll probably have to do that too. But finding out more information is like half the fun when it's something you're passionate and interested about.
Well, I want to thank, first of all, let's have a round of applause for our 3 panelists. Thank you so much. It was exciting to see not only the excellent presentations, but how they interwove together, all addressing issues related to sexuality and gender in the media. So thank you again for your questions and for attending and participating. And I think this room is closed until after lunch, but please come back after lunch at 12:30. And we have at least 2 more sessions of panels to come after lunch. So
More media criticism.
and more media in this room, right? Or is it?
No, D.
Let me find out. So we got a plug.
For our other universities, these were all Masons, but we have